I did my first doctoral dissertation in Dallas on genealogies. So that I worked on Genesis 10, but in doing it, I had to study what are genealogies, what are they doing, and so on. There are two kinds of genealogies in Genesis. There's the horizontal and the vertical. This way, this way. Genesis 10 is what we would call the horizontal genealogy, because it's not simply giving father, son, father, son, father, son. It's saying here's three sons, and here's their tribes, and all these tribes are on earth together. So see, they're horizontal. So the purpose of that kind of a genealogy in Genesis 10 is to show what the relationships are between the countries and the families of the world. So if the Israelites know there's a curse on Canaan, and they know that the Canaanites are related to these other people that came from Ham, it helps them to define. Or if the Philistines come in, but they're from Japheth, they might be there in the land the same time the Canaanites are in the land, but they came from a different place, so they're not included in the curse on Canaan. We might have to fight them because they're warriors, but that's different than the Canaanites. So a table of nations like Genesis 10, which is laying out all of the nations of the world, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Canaan, Greece, whatever, it shows where they came from, but its main purpose is to show the affiliations and relationships between these countries. We don't have many horizontal genealogies in the Bible, but Genesis 10 is the best example. Most genealogies are like Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, which trace the lineage. So Genesis 5 traces you from Adam to Noah, and Genesis 11 chases from Noah to Abram. So you get those two, and those are vertical because it doesn't spread out; it just goes down the line. Who's the descendant of whom? In one sense, for us in the modern world to look at that, we'd say, well, what's the point of saying that Adam was the first and Abram descended from Adam? Everybody descended from Adam, so that does. But what their desire is in a genealogy like that is to trace the route that the family came. So that, yes, you start with Adam, everybody comes from Adam, but then right away it divides. You've got Cain and you've got Seth. Well, it's out of Seth that you're going to go to Noah. Out of Cain, you're going to go to Lamech and different lines, and that's going to spread out. They're all going to spread out the longer they go on. But what the genealogy is trying to do is to make those connections. Adam, Seth, Noah, Shem, Abram, to show that the line to Abram comes through these righteous people that are in the genealogy. It's not just showing that they are descendants of Adam, because we all are, or descendants of Noah, because we all are, but to show that there's a heritage there of the spiritual, I guess we would say, there's a heritage of those who were the ones safeguarding the truth. The point of the genealogy is designed to show significant connections. One of the most interesting ones is at the end of the book of Ruth. At the end of the book of Ruth, you get the story where Ruth marries Boaz, and they have this big celebration. And then the text says they had a baby, and the baby is called Obed. So that's where the story ends. But there's tacked on to the end of the end of the story of Ruth a little genealogy. And it says, now Obed begat Salmon, Salmon begat Jesse, Jesse begat David the king. All of a sudden, that little genealogy at the end of Ruth is telling you why the book of Ruth is so important. If Boaz and Ruth don't get married, if there's no little baby Obed, there'll be no Jesse. There's no Jesse, there's no David. There's no king. So when the story of Ruth was told and then written down, people would say, well, it's a nice story, and it shows how God worked in the circumstances, and it shows the marriage, and it's romance, and God and faithful people. Yeah, all that's good and true. But the real purpose of the book was to authenticate David as God's person. Because Ruth and Boaz would have never gotten together if there hadn't been a famine, if Naomi and her family hadn't gone over to Moab, if they hadn't just happened to meet with Ruth, if they hadn't come back from that land, and if Ruth hadn't married into the family by faithfulness, and if Boaz hadn't been faithful to marry the deceased's wife, and so on, if none of that had happened, you wouldn't have had David. But because it all happened, God was working through the circumstances to bring about this wedding, to bring about the birth of Obed. So what the people of David's day could say, God was working through the circumstances of the ancestors of David to make sure we have a David. And so the purpose of that genealogy is to authenticate that David is here because of God's work in the history of the family. And the genealogy tells us why the story of the book of Ruth is necessary. So a genealogy will do far more than simply trace the heritage back to Adam. It's always necessary in a genealogy to be able to show the purpose of that.